A homeless woman is brought to court and is unjustly accused of crimes she did not commit. Everyone doubts her until one day a millionaire arrives. Emma Carter wrapped herself tighter in the frayed second-hand coat she had found 2 winters. Ego now barely holding together against the unforgiving Chicago wind. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray sky, covering the cracked sidewalks and the worn-out cardboard boxes she called home. Emma sat huddled in the entrance of a closed bookstore, knees drawn to her chest, shivering against the biting cold. That had become her nightly companion. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional car flashing by, indifferent to the suffering curled up in the shadows. She remembered when life had been different, before the endless string of layoffs, before the rent hikes, and before she found herself alone and forgotten. Emma had once worked as a waitress in a small but lively diner. She wasn't rich, but she had enough to pay rent and buy groceries. She had friends, laughter, and dreams. Now, every familiar street corner mocked her with memories of what she had lost. Yet amid the hardship, she refused to let go of a fragile hope, the only possession the streets had not stolen from her. Her hands, numb and raw, fumbled through a worn backpack, pulling out a stale, half-eaten sandwich she had saved from the day before. She chewed slowly, savoring every bite, knowing it might be her last meal until someone offered loose change or a half-finished cup of coffee. Around her, other homeless people had built makeshift camps, sharing body heat and stories of better days, but Emma often kept to herself. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Emma glanced at the towering buildings framing the skyline. Inside those warm apartments, families gathered around fireplaces, children played without fear of the cold, and people planned holidays without knowing how close some were to the edge. Emma could see their world, but could no longer touch it. She wondered if anyone even noticed her existence. To the majority of passers-by, she was just another invisible shadow on the streets. As the night deepened, Emma tried to sleep, curling into the narrow shelter of the bookstore doorway, but the cold seeped into her bones. Sleep was rarely peaceful. Her dreams often tangled with memories of warmth and safety, only to wake up to the cruel reminder of reality. Tonight, though, a sharp sound startled her awake. 2 police officers stood above her, flashlights aimed directly at her face. Emma Carter, one of them asked, flipping through a small notepad. The use of her full name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Nobody used her name anymore. She sat up, blinking against the beam of the flashlight. "Yes," she answered hesitantly. "You're under arrest," the officer said, reaching for his handcuffs. Emma's stomach dropped. "For what?" "I didn't do anything," she stammered, fear rising like bile in her throat. "You're being charged with multiple counts of theft," the officer stated flatly, as if he were talking about a parking ticket. "You have the right to remain silent." Emma's mind raced as she was pulled to her feet. Theft. She barely had enough energy to find scraps of food, let alone commit crimes. The cuffs dug into her wrists as the officers led her to the patrol car. The bitter cold outside paled in comparison to the cold terror sinking into her chest. No one passing by that night stopped to watch. In a city where countless invisible people lived on the margins, Emma's arrest was just another routine occurrence, easily ignored by those wrapped in their own lives. Emma pressed her forehead against the icy window of the police car, her breath fogging the glass. The street she had called home blurred past her, indifferent to her fate. In the holding cell, surrounded by other women who avoided eye contact or glared with suspicion, Emma sat on a narrow metal bench, clutching herself for warmth. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a sickly glow on the cracked concrete walls. Emma tried to make sense of what had happened. She had never stolen a thing in her life. She thought back to every corner, alley, and dumpster she had scavenged in recent weeks. Could someone have seen her nearby and assumed the worst? Her heart pounded as anxiety wrapped around her like chains. Hours later, a police officer returned with a folder in hand. "I'll see the judge tomorrow," he said bluntly, sliding a paper bag with a meager meal through the slot in the door. Emma barely acknowledged him. The idea of explaining herself in a courtroom where no one would believe her felt as futile, as screaming into the wind. Through the thin window, Emma could see the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon, illuminating the snow-covered streets. She wasn't ready for what tomorrow would bring. For the first time since ending up on the streets, she felt something far worse than the winter's cold, complete and absolute hopelessness. Yet, somewhere deep within, a stubborn ember refused to die out. Emma Carter wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Do you want me to proceed with part 2 following the same level of detail and length? Just give me your approval. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and polished brass. Emma Carter sat in the defendant's seat, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs, her clothes disheveled and her face pale with exhaustion. Around her the room buzzed with murmurs, quiet conversations, and the occasional shuffle of papers. It was a cold morning, but inside the courtroom Emma felt a different kind of chill, the kind that crept under her skin and settled deep in her bones. The judge, an older woman with a stern gaze and silver-streaked hair pulled tightly into a bun, surveyed the room with practiced indifference. Emma's eyes darted around, hoping for a familiar face, someone who might stand up and say this was all a mistake, but she was alone. The prosecutor, a sharply dressed man with a confident stride, stood up and began outlining the charges. He spoke, without hesitation, listing the string of thefts that had occurred over the past month in one of Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods. Jewelry, electronics, and cash were all stolen from well-secured homes. He pointed out that Emma had been seen in the area on multiple occasions, loitering, sleeping near alleys, or digging through trash bins. To him, these coincidences were evidence enough. Emma clenched her fists under the table, her breath quickening with each word. She had been there, yes, but not as a thief. She had been looking for food, for warmth, for anything to survive. When the prosecutor finished, the judge turned her attention to Emma. "Do you understand the charges against you?" she asked. Emma nodded, but inside she was screaming. She wanted to stand up and explain everything, but she knew how it would sound. A homeless woman claiming innocence when all the evidence pointed otherwise. It would be easier to convince, a stone wall to weep. Her public defender, Sarah Mitchell, sat beside her, barely concealing the fatigue in her eyes. Emma noticed how Sarah didn't even glance at her during the entire exchange. Sarah spoke softly, almost detached, explaining to the judge that Emma would plead not guilty. The judge barely nodded before moving on to the next order of business. Bail. Emma's heart lifted briefly at the word. Maybe, just maybe, she could walk out of here and at least try to find a way to defend herself properly. But as the prosecutor quickly pointed out, Emma had no permanent address, no employment, and no family to vouch for her. He argued that these were clear indications of a flight risk. Emma's lips parted, ready to protest, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on her arm, silently signaling her to stay quiet. The judge deliberated for a moment, flipping through a thin file of Emma's records. It was painfully obvious how little they knew about her, just a collection of police reports noting her presence in certain areas, a list of misdemeanors related to loitering or trespassing, none of which involved theft. Yet none of that seemed to matter. Without lifting her eyes from the file, the judge declared, "Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until trial." The words hit Emma like a blow to the chest. The courtroom seemed to tilt for a moment as she struggled to process the decision. The guard standing beside her gestured for her to stand. She obeyed, her knees weak, her eyes burning with unshed tears. As she was led out of the courtroom, she caught snippets of conversations, whispers that followed her like cruel echoes. "She looks guilty. They're always the same. I bet she's done worse." Back in the holding cell, Emma sat against the wall, knees to her chest, rocking slightly. She tried to remind herself that she hadn't done anything wrong, but the walls seemed to close in, amplifying every doubt. Sarah visited her briefly, bringing a small notepad and a few papers. She explained that they had 2 weeks before the trial and that she would try to gather more information, but Emma could tell by the flatness of Sarah's tone that her lawyer didn't believe in her innocence. Later that night, Emma stared through the narrow window, watching as the city lights flickered beyond the frost-covered glass. Her thoughts swirled with questions. How had it come to this? Could she prove she wasn't the thief? Would anyone even care if she did? The sense of hopelessness pressed on her, heavy and suffocating, Yet Emma refused to fully give in. She couldn't afford to. In the following days, the routine was always the same: bland meals, short walks in the small prison yard, and the constant judgment in the eyes of other inmates. Some avoided her, others jeered, already convinced she was guilty. Emma withdrew deeper into herself, replaying every moment of the past few weeks. She recalled passing those rich neighborhoods on her way to the soup kitchen, searching dumpsters for leftover food or seeking shelter near the back doors of closed shops. Could someone have seen her near the crime scenes? Was that all it took for them to brand her a criminal? Sarah visited again near the end of the week. This time, her voice had a sliver of urgency. "The prosecution is confident," she said bluntly. "Their case is built on your presence in the neighborhood and the testimonies of 2 witnesses who say they saw someone matching your description." Emma's stomach twisted. Matching your description. It was such a vague phrase, yet it carried the weight of conviction. "I didn't do it," Emma whispered, forcing herself to meet Sarah's eyes. Sarah shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Emma realized then that she was, for all intents and purposes, alone in this. Even her own defender doubted her. The walls of the visiting room seemed to press closer, leaving Emma barely enough space to breathe. That night, back in her cell, Emma stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the whispers, despite the cold certainty in everyone's eyes, Emma knew the truth. She was innocent. And even if no one else believed her, she had to hold on to that truth. The alternative was to let the city, the system, and the winter swallow her whole. Emma closed her eyes, bracing herself for the fight ahead, knowing that surviving the streets had been nothing compared to surviving what was coming. The sound of the heavy metal door echoed through the narrow hallway as Emma was led into the small, dimly lit room where her assigned public defender awaited. Sarah Mitchell sat behind a scratched wooden table, her blazer slightly wrinkled, her hair hastily pinned up, and dark circles shadowing her eyes. The fatigue was evident, not just in her appearance, but in the way she avoided Emma's gaze the moment the guards closed the door behind them. Emma cautiously took the seat opposite her, searching Sarah's expression for a hint of compassion or even curiosity, but instead found indifference. Sarah shuffled through a pile of papers without speaking. Minutes passed before she finally broke the silence, speaking without looking up. "Emma Carter, correct?" Emma gave a tentative nod, noticing how Sarah's tone carried the weight of resignation, as though Emma's case was just another number in a long list of burdens. "I've reviewed the files. The prosecution has 2 eyewitnesses who place you near the scenes of multiple thefts, and your presence has been consistently noted in police reports from that area. Given your situation, this doesn't look good." Emma felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I didn't do it," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. Sarah finally looked at her, her eyes betraying skepticism. "They all say that," Sarah replied bluntly. "I'm not here to judge you, Emma, but you need to understand the position you're in. You have no address, no job, no verifiable income. You've been seen repeatedly around the neighborhood where the thefts happened. To them, it's an open and shut case." Emma's hands tightened into fists under the table. "I was just looking for food. I've never stolen anything." Sarah leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as if trying to push away the weight of Emma's words. "That might be true, but juries don't usually give the benefit of the doubt to someone like you. This city is tired of petty crimes, and the DA is eager for a conviction. If we don't come up with a strong defense, you might be looking at several years." The words hung in the air, suffocating Emma more than the cold nights ever had. She wanted to shout, to demand Sarah believe her, but Emma recognized the emptiness in her defender's eyes. Sarah wasn't malicious, just overwhelmed, caught in a system that devoured the weak and spat them out broken. As the session dragged on, Sarah mechanically went over the logistics of the upcoming trial. Emma barely listened, her mind spinning. How could she convince a lawyer who didn't even believe her to fight for her? How could she face a courtroom where the judge and jury already saw her as guilty? At the end of their meeting, Sarah packed her files with an air of finality. "We'll meet again before the hearing," she said, rising without offering so much as a word of encouragement. Emma remained seated, staring at the table's scratched surface as if searching for answers in its worn grooves. When the guards returned to escort her back to the holding cell, she stood on autopilot, numb to everything around her. Days passed inside the county jail, each blending into the next. Emma became intimately familiar with the hollow routine, the tasteless meals, the guards in different orders, the wary stares of fellow inmates. She often found herself retreating into memories just to escape the grim reality, remembering the laughter inside the diner where she once worked, the soft hum of conversations, and the feeling of being part of something, no matter how small. One afternoon, Emma watched from behind the bars as another woman was led into the cell across from hers. The woman, younger but equally worn down, gave Emma a brief glance before curling up in a corner. Emma recognized the look in her eyes, the same blend of fear and resignation she saw in the mirror every day. It wasn't just about surviving behind bars, it was about surviving the belief that you belonged there. Sarah returned 5 days before the hearing, looking more disheveled than before. She carried a thin folder and an overworked expression. Sitting across from Emma again, she sighed heavily. "There's no new evidence, Emma. No one stepped forward. No security footage was recovered that could help us. Your best chance is to accept a plea deal." Emma's heart sank. Plea deal? The words tasted bitter. "You plead guilty to a lesser charge," Sarah explained. "Maybe reduce the sentence. With good behavior, you could be out in a couple of years." Emma's voice trembled, but she kept it steady. "I'm not guilty." Sarah's shoulders slumped as if Emma's insistence was a personal inconvenience. "Emma, I know you want to believe that telling your story will be enough, but juries don't see homeless women as trustworthy. They'll see the reports, the so-called witnesses, and they'll convict. I'm trying to help you stay out of prison for longer than necessary." Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I won't say I did something I didn't do." Sarah closed the folder, staring at Emma for a long, quiet moment. There was no anger in her eyes, just exhaustion, as though she had seen too many people like Emma crushed under the weight of the system. "I'll do what I can," she said finally, standing and leaving without another word. Emma remained at the table long after Sarah left. The guards didn't rush her. She sat there until the cold metal of the seat bit into her skin. The idea of giving up, of pleading guilty just to survive, gnawed at her. Yet in the pit of her stomach, Emma knew that giving up meant losing not just the trial, but herself. The days crawled by as the hearing approached. Emma watched through the cell, window as snow blanketed the prison yard. Outside, the city kept moving, oblivious to her existence. She wondered how many others were out there, silenced and discarded by a system that rarely cared about the truth. And yet, through it all, Emma refused to let go. The flame inside her, though faint and flickering, still burned. Even if no one believed her, not the police, not Sarah, not the judge, she could not allow herself to believe she was doomed. Emma would not surrender, not without a fight. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension as Emma Carter was brought in, her wrists still marked from the cuffs despite being removed moments earlier. The faint murmur of conversation among the audience ceased as the judge entered and took her seat, her gavel echoing against the walls, demanding order. Emma's eyes instinctively scanned the room for anyone who might be there on her behalf, but all she found were curious onlookers and cold, indifferent faces. Strangers filled the benches, some leaning forward, eager to witness what they presumed would be a simple case of guilt confirmed. Sarah Mitchell sat beside Emma, flipping through a thin folder with mechanical movements. Emma noted again how her attorney avoided eye contact, reinforcing the feeling that she was more a burden than a client. The prosecution, on the other hand, appeared confident and composed, with the assistant district attorney meticulously organizing his documents, occasionally glancing at Emma with barely concealed disdain. The judge adjusted her glasses and opened the proceedings. State of Illinois versus Emma Carter. The clerk's voice was steady, professional, but to Emma, every word sounded like the beginning of a formalized condemnation. Sarah stood and stated Emma's plea of not guilty, but the judge barely nodded before moving forward. Emma could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, not just from the judge's bench, but from every person seated behind her. The prosecutor wasted no time. He presented Emma's presence near the scenes of the crimes as if it were irrefutable proof. He emphasized the testimonies of 2 witnesses who had seen a woman matching Emma's description on the nights of the thefts, and the police reports documenting Emma's repeated presence in the neighborhood. His tone was calculated, painting Emma as someone who preyed on the wealthy out of desperation. The word opportunistic echoed through the courtroom, leaving Emma struggling to steady her breathing. Sarah's response was underwhelming. She mentioned Emma's lack of prior theft charges and questioned the credibility of identifying someone solely based on appearance, especially under poor lighting and stressful conditions. However, the argument seemed weak, barely registering with the judge or the spectators. Emma felt as if she were watching her own defense from the outside, disconnected and powerless, as if the battle had been lost before it had even begun. Then came the matter of bail. Sarah requested leniency, emphasizing Emma's willingness to appear for all future court dates and her ties to the city, however fragile they might be. The prosecutor countered swiftly, highlighting Emma's lack of stable housing and employment, describing her as a flight risk. The judge deliberated briefly, her expression unreadable before delivering the decision that shattered the little hope Emma had dared to nurture. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until the trial. The words felt heavier than iron. Emma's knees nearly buckled as the guards approached to escort her back, but she forced herself to remain upright. As she was led out, whispers filled the room. Some spectators exchanged glances of satisfaction, others of pity. Emma's ears caught fragments, obvious and no surprise. Look at her. Every word sank like a stone. Back in the holding cell, the concrete walls seemed colder than ever. Emma sat in the corner, staring at the small barred window near the ceiling. The sunlight filtered weakly through, unable to warm the bleak space. Around her, the other women continued their routines, seemingly unfazed by the new arrival. Some played cards. Others shared stories of arrests and sentences as if discussing mundane errands. Emma, however, remained silent, consumed by the weight of the day's events. As night approached, the cell grew even colder, and Emma's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Anger at the system that so easily discarded her, fear of what awaited her in the coming weeks, and above all, despair at the realization that no one, not even her own lawyer, truly believed she was innocent. Her thoughts returned to the streets she knew too well, the alleys where she had slept, the soup kitchens that barely met demand, the faces of other homeless souls who were equally invisible to society. It wasn't hard to imagine that many of them could end up just like her, accused without evidence, judged without mercy. Emma pressed her back against the cold wall, trying to find comfort where there was none. In the following days, Emma noticed how quickly news of her case spread. Inside the jail, other inmates started referring to her not as Emma, but as the thief. Some kept their distance while others occasionally taunted her. Each interaction chipped away at Emma's resolve. Yet, despite everything, she held on, not because she was certain of victory, but because surrender meant accepting a reality she knew was a lie. Emma's encounters with Sarah became more strained. During one of the brief meetings leading up to the trial, Sarah laid out their limited options. Without sugarcoating, they have the witnesses. They have you on multiple police reports. There's no surveillance footage clearing you. If you want to avoid the maximum sentence, you might want to reconsider a plea. Emma stared at Sarah, struggling to recognize in her the defender she had hoped for. "You don't believe me," Emma said quietly. Sarah paused, closing the file. "It's not about belief, Emma. It's about what I can prove, and right now the odds are stacked against you." Emma clenched her jaw, swallowing the frustration threatening to rise. She wanted to shout that she wasn't just another statistic, but what would it change? Sarah had already categorized her, just like everyone else. As Emma returned to the holding cell that evening, a sense of resignation threatened to take over. Yet amid the chaos of her thoughts, there remained a stubborn ember. Emma didn't know where it came from or how long it would last, but it was there, the unwillingness to let go completely. She was innocent, and somehow, even if the city, the courts, and even her own defender refused to see it, she had to hold on to that truth. It was all she had left. Locked within the confines of the cold cell, Emma found herself caught between memories and fear. Each passing day leading to the trial made her restless, consumed by the same questions circling endlessly in her mind. She replayed every single moment she had spent in the neighborhoods, now central to her case, searching for anything that could explain why she was suddenly the prime suspect. The prosecutor had mentioned her presence, not once but multiple times, around the areas where the thefts had occurred. Emma knew those streets too well, not as a criminal but as a desperate soul trying to survive in a city that offered no refuge. The west side of Chicago had been Emma's reluctant shelter during the harshest nights. She remembered the narrow alleys behind the old brick houses, the dumpsters that were sometimes filled with stale bread or bruised fruits thrown out by indifferent store owners, and the hidden alcoves where the wind didn't bite as fiercely. She hadn't chosen that neighborhood out of preference. It was survival. The affluent houses there, bordered by crumbling areas, made it one of the few places where the likelihood of discarded food was higher. Emma recalled with precision the nights in question, recognizing that she had indeed been near some of the homes now marked as crime scenes. The memories were vivid, not of theft, but of her rummaging through overflowing garbage bins or searching for cardboard to insulate herself from the biting wind. The coincidences terrified her. From the prosecutor's point of view, her mere proximity might as well have been a confession. The realization struck Emma like a punch. Even if she could explain, who would believe it? To the courtroom, she would sound like every other defendant claiming innocence. In the sterile logic of the law, presence equaled suspicion. For Emma, presence had simply been necessity. In the days that followed, Emma became increasingly withdrawn. She found herself staring at the cracks in the cell walls, tracing them with her eyes, as if they formed a map leading to some kind of salvation. Other inmates kept their distance, but Emma could hear their whispers at night. Words like guilty and easy target floated in the air, mixing with the rustling of blankets and the echo of distant footsteps. Sarah's occasional visits offered no comfort. Each time, Emma tried to explain, tried to make her see that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet Sarah's responses remained mechanical. "Emma, without proof, there's little I can do," she repeated during their last meeting, rubbing her temples with evident frustration. "The prosecution will hammer on the fact that you were always there." Emma didn't blame her entirely. Sarah was overwhelmed, juggling dozens of cases with no real resources. But Emma needed more than legal representation. She needed someone who genuinely cared enough to look beyond the obvious. She could see it in Sarah's eyes, the silent acceptance that Emma might just be another lost cause in a broken system. One evening, curled on her bunk, Emma forced herself to revisit every detail again. The first theft happened during a particularly brutal cold front. She remembered specifically because it was the same night she had nearly passed out from exposure before finding temporary refuge behind a church. The second incident coincided with a soup kitchen's rare late-night meal service. She had left just before dawn and walked the blocks where the theft had occurred, searching for discarded food. The third night, she had settled near an alley, behind a bakery, scavenging expired goods tossed in the back. Emma's heart raced as she realized how damning it all looked on paper. A desperate woman constantly in the vicinity of crimes, with no alibi but her own struggle to survive. She knew that anyone looking from the outside would see patterns that weren't there. What were the odds that her fight for scraps had intersected perfectly with a criminal's trail? She clung to the possibility that someone must have seen her, really seen her on those nights. Maybe a store clerk locking up late, another homeless person who might have noticed her nowhere near the crime scenes at the times in question. But without a name or a witness, this hope felt like clutching smoke. The worst part wasn't just the fear of being found guilty. It was the growing horror that no one wanted to look deeper. Emma's life had been reduced to a few files, a list of misdemeanors for sleeping where she shouldn't, and vague witness statements that didn't even describe her fully, just someone who could fit the profile. The city that had ignored her suffering now focused its full attention on condemning her without a second thought. Each sleepless night sharpened Emma's anxiety. She barely touched the meager meals delivered to her cell, and her ribs began to show under the thin fabric of her jumpsuit. The guards noticed but said nothing. In their eyes, she was just another case number, another statistic. Emma feared that even if she survived the trial, the psychological toll might have already broken her. On the eve of the next hearing, Sarah appeared once more. Emma hoped foolishly that maybe this time her defender would bring news of a breakthrough. Instead, Sarah only informed her that the trial was moving forward as scheduled, and that there were still no witnesses or evidence clearing her. Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to beg Sarah to look harder, to see her not as a file, but as a person. Sarah noticed Emma's shaking hands and hesitated. "Look, Emma, the system isn't kind to people in your position. It's not always about truth. It's about what can be proven. Keep that in mind." Emma said nothing. She simply nodded, biting down her emotions until the metallic taste of restraint filled her mouth. When Sarah left, Emma curled into herself, on the cold bench, staring at the ceiling as tears slid silently down her face. As the cell lights dimmed for the night, Emma realized with a heavy heart that hope alone would not be enough. Even as she held on to the truth of her innocence, the coincidences surrounding her situation threatened to shatter what little defense she had left. Emma wasn't just fighting the accusation, she was fighting a city that had already decided her fate. The day of the second court session arrived under a sky heavy with snow clouds, casting a grim pall over the towering buildings of downtown Chicago. Emma stood stiffly between two officers as they escorted her into the courtroom, the chill from outside still clinging to her skin. The room, already tense with the anticipation of the trial's progression, seemed fuller than before. The familiar faces of court employees and local reporters were present, but Emma noticed something different. A figure seated quietly in the back row, sharply dressed but unassuming. His presence didn't spark whispers or draw attention, yet Emma's eyes were drawn to him instinctively. Victor Langston, known to many only through newspaper articles and philanthropic headlines, sat with his hands clasped, observing everything with quiet intensity. Unlike the curious onlookers who seemed hungry for drama, Victor watched with a demeanor of someone searching for answers rather than spectacle. Emma didn't recognize him. How could she? To her, he was just another well-dressed stranger in a courtroom filled with indifferent faces, but Victor knew exactly who Emma was. He had read about the case the previous evening, and for reasons he could not fully articulate, had felt compelled to witness it for himself. The session began routinely. The judge reaffirmed the charges, the prosecutor reiterated the alleged sequence of events with calculated precision, and Sarah stood with an air of defeat shadowing her every word. Emma, though trying to remain composed, could feel the walls closing in tighter with each minute. The mention of the witnesses, the repeated emphasis on her proximity to the crime scenes, and the fact that she had no verifiable alibi were all laid bare once again. Victor's eyes never left Emma throughout the proceedings. He noticed the subtleties most others ignored, the way Emma's fists trembled beneath the table, the quiet desperation in her posture, and the absence of confidence in her lawyer's voice. To Victor, these details didn't speak of guilt, but of abandonment. He had seen many like Emma before, people crushed not just by life but by a system too blind to see beyond statistics. During a recess, Emma sat alone, her head resting against the cold wood of the defense table. Sarah had disappeared momentarily to speak with court clerks, leaving Emma adrift amid the noise of the courtroom. Victor, without hesitation, stood and exited quietly, making his way through the courthouse corridors until he found Sarah standing near the vending machines, scrolling through her phone. "Ms. Mitchell," he said calmly. Sarah looked up, surprised, instinctively clutching the files in her arms. "Yes?" "I'm Victor Langston," he said, offering his hand. "I'd like to speak to you about your client." Sarah blinked. She recognized the name immediately. The Victor Langston. I believe your client is innocent, Victor continued, ignoring her astonishment. And I'd like to help. Sarah narrowed her eyes, skepticism flickering across her face. Look, I don't know what your angle is, but this isn't exactly a charity case. The evidence is stacked against her. Victor's voice remained steady, and yet something about it doesn't sit right with me. I've seen people framed, coerced, or simply lost in the system enough times to recognize when something is wrong. Emma doesn't strike me as a thief. Sarah crossed her arms. With all due respect, Mr. Langston, this isn't about intuition. It's about what we can prove. Exactly, Victor replied. And I can help you find proof if you're willing. Sarah hesitated. She had worked long enough in the public defender's office to know better than to trust sudden interest from wealthy benefactors. Still, there was something about Victor's calm, measured demeanor that unsettled her. Not in a threatening way, but in the way he seemed genuinely convinced of Emma's innocence without even knowing her. I can't accept private interference in an ongoing case, Sarah said cautiously. I'm not asking to interfere, Victor countered. I'm offering resources, a private investigator, access to records, anything you might need to look deeper. If you decline, I'll walk away. But if you accept, we might uncover what the police overlooked. Sarah studied him carefully. Emma's case was weak. The chances of acquittal were slim to none. She had considered asking for continuance just to delay the inevitable. Victor's offer, although unconventional, could be the lifeline Emma needed. Still, accepting help from a millionaire who just happened to wander into court felt almost absurd. I'll consider it, Sarah finally said, unwilling to show how intrigued she truly was. Victor nodded. I'll be available when you're ready. Back inside the courtroom, Emma remained unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. The trial resumed with its cold, relentless rhythm. Witnesses described seeing someone matching her description near the crime scenes, painting a picture carefully curated by the prosecution. Emma sat silently, hearing her own life reduced to scraps of circumstantial evidence and biased assumptions. Yet for the first time since her arrest, someone was watching her differently, not as a criminal or a hopeless case, but as a person who might, just might, be telling the truth. As the session ended and Emma was led back to the holding cell, Victor remained seated until the courtroom emptied. His eyes lingered on the defendant's table, processing everything he had just seen. He had no personal stake in Emma's fate, yet he felt the pull of responsibility, not because he was wealthy, but because he knew the weight of silence. He had seen too many lives ruined not by guilt, but by the absence of someone willing to ask the right questions. That night, as Emma sat staring at the flickering ceiling light in her cell, unaware of the storm quietly gathering beyond the courtroom walls, Victor Langston made a decision. He would not walk away. Whether Emma liked it or not, help was already on its way. The following morning, the courthouse was quieter, but the weight in Emma's chest had only grown heavier. Sitting once again beside Sarah, who kept thumbing through the same documents without any signs of hope, Emma prepared for another day of futile struggle. Yet what she didn't know was that beyond the courtroom doors, something had already shifted. Victor Langston, true to his word, returned to the courthouse, not as a mere spectator this time, but as a man with a purpose. When the session adjourned, temporarily for a recess, Sarah collected her files with practiced monotony, clearly intending to retreat into her usual silence. As she exited the courtroom, Victor intercepted her in the hallway with quiet determination. "Miss Mitchell, a word," he asked, his voice composed but firm. Sarah exhaled sharply. "Mr. Langston, I said I'd consider it, and I'm here to see if you've made up your mind," Victor replied without missing a beat. Sarah hesitated, glancing down the hallway before signaling him to follow her into a small, unused conference room. Inside, away from the cold scrutiny of the courthouse, Sarah leaned against the table and crossed her arms. "You're persistent," she admitted. Victor nodded. "Persistence is the only reason I'm standing here." Sarah scrutinized him carefully. "Why do you care? What's in it for you?" Victor answered without blinking. "I care because I've seen people like Emma crushed under this system. People ignored because they don't fit the profile of someone worth saving. I have the resources to help if you let me." Sarah folded her arms tighter. "And if I say yes, you'll just—" "What? Start playing detective?" Victor smiled faintly. "I'll assign professionals, people I trust, investigators who know how to look where no one has bothered to look yet. If Emma is guilty, you'll know. If she's innocent, you might finally have what you need to prove it." Sarah's skepticism softened slightly. Emma's case had felt like a slow-motion train wreck from the start. The truth was, she had nothing to lose. "Fine," she said at last, "but I'm doing this by the book. No backdoor dealings, no surprises." "Agreed," Victor replied. Later that day, Sarah returned to Emma's holding cell with a different energy, though still measured. Emma noticed the subtle shift immediately. Sarah, who had previously sat with her as if ticking off a box, now seemed to actually engage. "We may have help," Sarah said without ceremony. Emma frowned, unsure whether to be hopeful. "What do you mean?" "A man named Victor Langston," Sarah replied, watching Emma closely. "You might not know him, but he's, well, very resourceful. He believes you. For some reason, he's offering to help." Emma blinked in disbelief. "Why would a stranger believe me when no one else does?" Sarah shrugged, though Emma could tell she wasn't fully sure herself. "I don't know, but he's putting people on this, investigators, and frankly, it's more than I've got." Emma leaned back against the wall of the small visitors' room, trying to process the sudden shift. She had stopped expecting anyone to believe her long ago. Yet now, out of nowhere, a man with power and influence was offering assistance. It felt almost cruel, like hope dangled just out of reach, but Sarah seemed more serious than Emma had ever seen her. "Listen, I don't know if this will change anything," she admitted, "but it's the first real chance you've got." Back at his office, Victor wasted no time. Within hours, his team of private investigators, led by a seasoned woman named Elaine Porter, began digging through every aspect of the case. They reviewed police reports, interviewed shop owners and janitors in the neighborhood where the thefts occurred, and scoured surveillance footage the authorities hadn't bothered to collect. Elaine, hardened by years of uncovering the mistakes of law enforcement, immediately sensed that the case against Emma was fragile. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was lazy. Within days, they found discrepancies, timelines didn't quite align. Several businesses near the crime scenes had security cameras that had never been reviewed. Elaine obtained copies of the footage and pored over every frame. Emma appeared in some of them, yes, but never near the actual thefts at the times they occurred. More importantly, another figure, blurred but noticeably different in stature and clothing, was present near at least 2 of the targeted houses. It wasn't much yet, but it was something, enough to suggest Emma's supposed guilt was at the very least questionable. Victor reviewed Elaine's findings personally. The grainy images weren't definitive proof of Emma's innocence, but they opened a door no one else had cared to look behind. Victor knew well enough that sometimes in cases like this, the first step was simply proving there was more than what the prosecution claimed. Meanwhile, Emma remained in the jail, unaware of the gathering momentum. The weight of the past weeks made it difficult for her to hope fully. But something about Sarah's tone in their last meeting lingered in her mind. It wasn't pity or resignation this time. It was curiosity, maybe even the faintest spark of belief. Victor returned to the courthouse days later, sitting once again at the back without drawing attention. Watching Emma as she was brought in, still wearing the same ill-fitting jumpsuit and carrying the same haunted expression, Victor realized that this wasn't about charity. It was about refusing to let another life vanish under the weight of indifference. As Emma prepared for another session that would likely echo the others, accusations without substance, evidence without context, she had no idea that outside the courtroom walls, the narrative was beginning to crack. For the first time, someone was finally asking the right questions, and someone, without expecting anything in return, believed her. Elaine Porter moved through the streets of Chicago with the practiced precision of someone who had unraveled more cases than she could count. She knew where to look when others gave up, how to dig beneath layers of negligence, and most importantly, how to spot details others dismissed. Within days of taking over the investigation for Victor Langston, she had already discovered that the police had conducted a superficial review of the surveillance footage. Entire portions of relevant streets hadn't been cross-referenced with the theft's timelines. Some cameras belonging to small businesses or even private residences hadn't even been considered. The first piece of significant evidence surfaced from a neighborhood bakery. The owners, an elderly couple, had a habit of leaving an old security camera running after hours, not to prevent crime but simply because they never bothered to turn it off. No one had asked them for the footage. Elaine did. As she sat alone in the back office of the bakery, scrolling through hours of grainy images, her eyes narrowed as she paused on a figure crossing behind the alley adjacent to the second crime scene. It wasn't Emma. The person was taller, broader, wearing a hooded jacket far different from anything Emma owned. More tellingly, the figure seemed purposeful, slipping through shadows with the familiarity of someone who knew where the blind spots were. Elaine's instincts went on high alert. She immediately marked the footage and requested copies from other nearby establishments, noticing a pattern. A similar figure appeared near the first and third theft locations as well. The times of appearance, aligned suspiciously close to the theft windows, never overlapping with Emma's scavenging routes. Elaine met with Victor that evening, laying out the findings on his desk. "This is your gap," she said plainly. "Your client wasn't the only one near those houses. In fact, I'd say the real suspect is this person here." Victor leaned forward, analyzing the frozen frames. "Can we get a clear ID?" Elaine shook her head. "Not yet. The footage isn't clear enough for facial recognition, but this changes the narrative. Emma was there, yes, but she wasn't alone. And this person wasn't random. They moved like they knew exactly where to go and when." Victor nodded. "Good work. Keep pushing." The next day, Elaine's team expanded their search, canvassing the neighborhood, speaking to anyone willing to talk. Most brushed them off, unwilling to involve themselves in what they saw as another criminal case. But persistence paid off. A janitor from a nearby community center recalled seeing a similar figure late at night during one of the theft nights, carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag and walking with deliberate steps, avoiding well-lit areas. The pieces began to fit together. Whoever the real culprit was, they operated methodically, blending into areas where people like Emma, the homeless, were common and easily blamed. Elaine suspected that this wasn't just random theft. It had the marks of someone exploiting the overlooked presence of the homeless population to mask their crimes. Back at the courthouse, Sarah was both skeptical and intrigued when Victor presented the preliminary findings. "It's not enough for a full defense yet," she said cautiously, but there was no denying that the evidence could plant doubt in the judge's mind. Victor agreed, but insisted. "Emma is being railroaded based on assumptions. This might not be the final proof, but it's enough to question the entire case." When Sarah met Emma later that evening, Emma immediately noticed her attorney's change in demeanor. Sarah no longer sat as if waiting for the inevitable. Instead, she leaned forward with intent. "There's something you should know," Sarah began. "Victor's team found surveillance footage showing someone else near the crime scenes. Someone who doesn't match your description." Emma blinked, barely able to process the words. Someone else. The thought had crossed her mind so many times, but hearing it confirmed aloud made it feel real for the first time. Sarah nodded. "It's not a complete exoneration yet. The footage is unclear, but it shows you weren't alone. This could be enough to challenge the prosecution's narrative." Emma's heart pounded. For the first time, there was a crack in the wall closing in around her. The mere existence of another figure changed everything. It meant she hadn't been entirely invisible, that maybe someone else had seen the truth too, just as Victor and his team had. In the days that followed, Victor expanded his efforts. His investigators dug deeper into the background of the thefts, and what they uncovered was even more disturbing. Several of the homes targeted were insured through the same company, and a pattern of minor claims and payouts had been recorded, suggesting that these thefts might have been more than just random acts. Elaine began piecing together a theory. Someone was orchestrating these crimes with the intent of framing homeless individuals to both deflect attention and potentially exploit the insurance system. Emma wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She had been set up, intentionally or not, as the perfect scapegoat. Victor's commitment only deepened. For him, this case was no longer just about Emma. It was about exposing how easily society allowed the most vulnerable to be discarded, blamed and punished without a second thought. He knew he was treading into dangerous territory. People who operated with this level of calculation rarely did so without powerful incentives. But he wasn't deterred. Meanwhile, Emma felt the tension inside her shifting. It wasn't gone, but for the first time, hope wasn't just an abstract idea. It was something tangible, a fragile but undeniable chance. When she returned to her cell each night, she stared at the ceiling not with resignation, but with cautious resolve. Unbeknownst to her, the case against her was quietly unraveling. Each uncovered detail, each fragment of overlooked evidence, was bringing her one step closer to the truth, and one step closer to the moment when the city of Chicago would be forced to reckon with how easily it had condemned an innocent woman. Helene Porter's instincts sharpened as the evidence continued to mount. It wasn't just about random appearances of a mysterious figure caught on grainy footage anymore. Patterns began to surface that hinted at something far more sinister and calculated. Late-night interviews with other homeless individuals who frequented the West Side uncovered alarming whispers of a group that operated in the shadows, manipulating those who lived on the streets. Some called them the Shadows, or simply them, vague references whispered under breath out of fear. Victor Langston, reviewing Elaine's daily reports, sensed that they were closing in on something that exceeded even his initial suspicions. It wasn't merely a single thief at work, but an organized network exploiting the city's invisible population. Elaine's interviews revealed that small groups of homeless individuals were often coerced, threatened, or lured into unknowingly assisting in petty crimes. They were used as distractions, bait, or simply scapegoats. And among them, Emma's name surfaced, not as a participant, but as someone who was consistently seen nearby, likely marked early on by those orchestrating the scheme. Victor summoned Elaine for an urgent meeting. "You're telling me there's a system behind this, not just coincidence?" he asked. Elaine nodded gravely. "It's coordinated. They operate behind the scenes, using people like Emma. Most of the homeless we talk to won't go on record out of fear, but they all mention the same thing. Someone watching, giving orders, paying small sums for favors without revealing the bigger picture." "What about the real perpetrator? The one caught on the tapes?" "We believe he's part of it," Elaine replied. "Someone who blends in, someone who knows exactly when and where to act, using the chaos of homelessness as a smokescreen." Victor felt a surge of anger. It wasn't just that Emma was innocent. She had been targeted, used by people who understood that society wouldn't bother to look twice. "Keep digging," he instructed. "Find me names." Meanwhile, Sarah met Emma again, this time with an urgency Emma hadn't seen before. The walls of the visitor's room felt less oppressive as Sarah explained what Victor's team had uncovered. "They've found proof of a pattern," Sarah said. "It's not just you, Emma. Others have been used too. You were at the wrong place at the wrong time, but so were others. The difference is, you got caught." Emma felt a confusing wave of relief and horror. Relief that the truth was beginning to surface. Horror at realizing how easily she had been ensnared by circumstances beyond her control. "So they knew," Emma murmured. "They knew people wouldn't care." Sarah nodded solemnly. "That's exactly it." Back on the streets, Elaine's team worked relentlessly. They traced financial records, uncovering small but suspicious payments made to homeless individuals through intermediaries. Some of these payments coincided directly with the dates of the thefts. Cross-referencing witness accounts and security footage revealed that the same figure, the man in the hood, was present at multiple scenes, often coordinating from the shadows, while homeless individuals loitered nearby, unaware they were part of a larger orchestration. Victor arranged a private meeting with Sarah and Elaine in his office. Maps, documents, and photographs covered every surface. Elaine pointed to the connections they had uncovered. "This isn't just exploitation. It's systematic. And there's a name that keeps coming up, Derek Malone." Sarah frowned. "Who's Derek Malone?" "A former security contractor who lost his license years ago," Elaine explained. "Since then, he's been operating under the radar, hiring small crews for off-the-books jobs. He knows how to bypass surveillance and, more importantly, how to make sure someone else takes the fall." Victor leaned back, realizing the full gravity of what they were up against. "And you think he's the one orchestrating this?" "I'd bet my career on it," Elaine replied. With this breakthrough, Sarah saw a flicker of genuine hope. It wasn't just about defending Emma anymore. It was about exposing an operation that preyed on the city's most vulnerable. She immediately requested an emergency hearing, armed with the initial findings provided by Victor's team. The following day, Emma sat nervously in the courtroom as Sarah presented the motion to the judge. The prosecutor scoffed at first, dismissing it as a last-ditch effort. But as Sarah calmly laid out the evidence, the surveillance footage, the financial records, the pattern of manipulation, the judge leaned forward, her interest piqued. The courtroom, once filled with whispers doubting Emma, now fell into an uneasy silence. The judge didn't immediately rule on the motion, but requested all evidence to be submitted formally for review. The subtle shift in the room was undeniable. Emma could feel it, the way eyes now lingered on her, not with condemnation, but with uncertainty. That night, alone in her cell, Emma's thoughts raced. For so long she had accepted that no one would ever believe her, that she was doomed to be just another statistic. But now, as the snow piled against the barred window and the city beyond continued its indifferent rhythm, Emma realized that maybe, just maybe, she was finally being seen. Not as a criminal, but as someone who had been silenced for too long. And for the first time, the walls around her felt less like a cage and more like the thin, cracking shell of a case on the verge of breaking open. The courtroom was colder than usual, as if the old stone walls had absorbed the bitter winter air and refused to release it. Emma sat quietly next to Sarah, hands folded tightly in her lap, barely able to keep them from trembling. She could sense the change in the room. It wasn't just another hearing anymore. There was tension, but also curiosity. Reporters who hadn't cared before now filled the gallery, and unfamiliar faces dotted the benches, likely there due to rumors of new developments. For the first time, Emma noticed a subtle shift in the eyes watching her. They were no longer filled purely with condemnation, but with something resembling doubt. Sarah stood to address the judge, her voice firmer than Emma had ever heard it. The weeks working alongside Victor's team had reignited something within the public defender. Gone was the mechanical recitation of court procedures. In its place stood a lawyer determined to fight. "Your Honor," Sarah began, "in light of new evidence, we are formally challenging the prosecution's narrative." The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the stack of documents submitted the day before. "Proceed." Sarah systematically laid out the findings, avoiding theatricality, letting the evidence speak for itself. She presented the overlooked surveillance footage showing the unidentified figure lurking near the crime scenes, the payments traced to Derek Malone's associates, and testimonies from other homeless individuals who had been used similarly. Sarah even displayed maps marked with patterns connecting Malone's movements to the thefts, painting a picture far more convincing than the prosecution's simple assertion of Emma's guilt. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and speculative. But for the first time, the judge didn't immediately side with him. Instead, she leaned back, studying the information carefully, and asked probing questions. How could the prosecution dismiss footage clearly showing someone else in the vicinity? Why had no officer explored the possibility of organized exploitation? The courtroom murmured, as Sarah confidently answered each inquiry, grounding every claim in verifiable evidence. Emma sat motionless, almost numb. She could hardly believe the sudden transformation of her defense. Each piece of evidence felt like a brick being removed from the wall that had cornered her. She glanced at Victor in the back of the courtroom. He remained calm, simply observing, yet Emma could feel his quiet determination. As the proceedings continued, Sarah didn't just question the events of the nights in question. She questioned the entire foundation of the case against Emma. She highlighted how the initial investigation had focused solely on Emma from the outset, ignoring leads, dismissing alternative suspects, and reducing her to nothing more than a convenient explanation. The judge, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, showed signs of hesitation for the first time since Emma's ordeal began. "I will admit," she said slowly, "this case has taken a turn." She ordered the prosecutor to respond formally to the defense's new submissions within 48 hours and adjourned the session, leaving a courtroom buzzing with speculation. Outside, as Emma was led back through the courthouse corridors, she caught snippets of conversations. Reporters whispered about the mysterious figure, about Derek Malone, about the failures of the initial police work. Emma knew better than to take it as a victory yet, but the fact that people were finally talking about the truth instead of blindly assuming her guilt was enough to loosen, if only slightly, the weight she carried. Back in her cell, the guards' attitudes were subtly different. The usual indifference seemed replaced with uncertain glances. Emma couldn't tell if it was pity, guilt, or mere curiosity, but it felt different. For once, she was not merely the invisible woman accused of theft. She was someone whose story demanded attention. Victor and Elaine, meanwhile, continued their investigation relentlessly. Elaine tracked Malone's activities, digging deeper into his past and his current operations. What they found unsettled even Victor. Malone's network extended beyond just Emma's case. Several incidents across different neighborhoods bore striking similarities, all involving vulnerable individuals strategically placed near crimes only to become suspects themselves. The city had a pattern of closing cases without ever connecting the dots. Sarah returned to meet Emma, this time without the heavy cloud of resignation. "The judge is listening," she said quietly. "She's not convinced yet." "But she's listening," Emma nodded, swallowing hard. "Do you think it's enough?" Sarah hesitated, then replied honestly, "It might be. And it's more than we've had since this started." The following day, Victor personally met with Sarah and Elaine, reviewing every detail once more. They were close, but Victor knew that a judge wouldn't overturn the narrative based solely on implication. They needed more. They needed Malone himself or someone inside his circle willing to talk. As the city carried on, unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding behind courtroom doors, Emma clung to the small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the tide was finally shifting. She had spent weeks suffocating under the weight of assumptions and silence. Now, even if the walls were still standing, cracks were beginning to show, and in those cracks, Emma saw for the first time in months the faint but undeniable glimmer of light. Victor Langston sat in the dimly lit office of his foundation, staring at the array of documents, maps, and photographs sprawled across the table. He had grown accustomed to confronting injustice from a distance, funding programs, advocating for policy change, but this case had become personal. It was no longer just about Emma Carter. It was about exposing a web of exploitation that preyed on the most vulnerable. And yet one question remained unanswered. How could Malone and his network operate so effectively without someone noticing? Victor's instincts told him the answer lay closer to home than anyone realized. Elaine Porter was the one who stumbled upon the missing piece. Late one night, cross-referencing internal security records from Victor's own philanthropic foundation, with public surveillance data, she noticed irregularities. One of Victor's mid-level employees, Thomas Greaves, appeared frequently near the neighborhoods where the thefts occurred, always on nights coinciding with the crimes. Greaves had no apparent reason to be there. Worse, his access logs at the foundation revealed tampering with records related to grants distributed to organizations assisting homeless populations. Elaine reported immediately. Victor, blindsided, struggled to process the betrayal. Greaves had worked at his foundation for years, trusted implicitly. Yet the evidence was clear. Greaves had maintained contact with Malone's network, providing inside information about areas where homeless individuals gathered, which neighborhoods were more vulnerable, and even adjusting foundation funds to indirectly enable Malone's operations through seemingly legitimate donations. Victor didn't hesitate. The next morning, Greaves was summoned under the pretense of a private meeting. Sitting across from Victor and Elaine, Greaves maintained composure until confronted with the overwhelming evidence. The surveillance images, the manipulated financial records, the witness statements tying him to Malone's crew. Slowly, the mask cracked. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Greaves admitted quietly, staring at his hands. "It was just supposed to be about minor hits, small insurance jobs. Malone said no one would get hurt. Victor's voice remained steady, but the fury beneath it was unmistakable. "You let them frame innocent people, Thomas. You let them destroy lives." Greaves sank further into his chair. "I didn't know they'd pin it all on her. I thought it'd be blamed on random break-ins unsolved, nothing sticking to anyone." Elaine leaned forward. "And yet, when Emma got arrested, you said nothing." Greaves's silence was damning. Victor knew this was the key. With Greaves's confession and the documentation to back it, they could prove not only Emma's innocence, but expose the entire network operating behind the city's facade. Sarah was immediately informed. When she presented the new evidence to the judge, supported by Victor's direct affidavit and Greaves's recorded confession, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. Gone was the smug assurance on the prosecutor's face. Gone was the silent judgment from the gallery. Instead, a tense silence settled as Sarah methodically outlined the operation, concluding with Greaves's admission. Emma sat frozen, barely able to process what she was hearing. For so long she had been preparing for the worst, steeling herself for the inevitability of a system too blind to care. But now, the system itself seemed shaken. The judge took her time reviewing the documents, flipping through every page carefully. Finally, she looked up, scanning the room. "This court will require formal proceedings to process this new information, but it is apparent that the prosecution's case has been severely compromised." She turned to Emma. "Ms. Carter, you will remain in custody for the moment, but I am ordering immediate consideration for bail, pending the outcome of the next session." Sarah nodded in quiet triumph, while Emma blinked, too overwhelmed to respond. The hearing adjourned, but the damage to the prosecution's case was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah and Victor, demanding explanations, while whispers about Malone's network and Greaves's betrayal began circulating rapidly. Emma escorted quietly back to her cell, sat down heavily, still trembling. The guards, once indifferent, now looked at her differently. Not as the accused, but as someone who might actually be the victim she claimed to be. Victor visited Emma later that evening, granted a short meeting by Sarah's request. Sitting across from her through the cold glass barrier, he spoke softly. "I know you don't know me, Emma, but I've seen too many people like you disappear. Into a system that doesn't care. I won't let that happen." Emma struggled to find words. "Why me?" she asked, voice raw. "Why did you believe me when no one else did?" Victor's expression softened. "Because you never stopped telling the truth, even when no one listened." Emma pressed her hand against the glass, overwhelmed by the simple, undeniable truth of it. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. As the city outside continued its frantic pace, unaware of the full scope of the revelation, Emma realized that she was no longer fighting alone. The next hearing wouldn't just be another step toward a verdict. It would be the beginning of a reckoning. The morning of the final hearing broke with a heavy, overcast sky pressing against the city like a physical weight. Inside the courthouse, however, the air was thick not with snow, but with anticipation. Emma was led into the courtroom with noticeably less hostility from the guards, and the spectators now watched her, not with dismissive glances, but with curiosity, and even, from a few faces, sympathy. Reporters lined the back rows, scribbling, notes, cameras flashing intermittently, feeding the growing storm that Victor Langston had ignited. Sarah sat beside Emma, composed but visibly resolute. The documents now in her possession, fortified by Greaves's full confession and the chain of evidence built by Elaine and Victor's team, had shifted the dynamic entirely. Even the prosecutor, usually so poised, looked less sure of himself, fumbling through papers as if searching for an argument that could still hold water. When the judge entered, the room silenced instantly. Without ceremony, she addressed the court. "I have reviewed the new evidence submitted by the defense, including the sworn affidavit from Thomas Greaves and corroborating documents. The material presented indicates a substantial miscarriage of justice." Sarah stood, her voice steady. "Your Honor, we are formally moving for all charges against Emma Carter to be dropped, effective immediately. Furthermore, we request an inquiry into the handling of this case by the initial investigators." The prosecutor's attempt to object was feeble. The judge raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Enough. The court finds that the defense has presented sufficient grounds to consider Ms. Carter's arrest and subsequent charges nullified, due to clear evidence of manipulated circumstances and withheld information. Emma barely registered the words. The world around her blurred as tears welled up uncontrollably. After months of silence, fear, and fighting to be heard, she heard the only words that mattered. "Ms. Carter, you are free to go." The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras clicked furiously, and Victor remained in the back, watching quietly as the system he had long criticized finally corrected itself, if only for this one case. As Emma was led out of the courtroom, no longer as a prisoner but as a free woman, she could hardly keep her balance. The hallway outside was filled with reporters shouting questions, demanding statements, but Emma, overwhelmed, kept her head down. Victor was waiting at the end of the hall, and as their eyes met, Emma froze, realizing fully for the first time that this stranger had been the catalyst for everything that had turned the tide. They stepped outside together into the gray light. "Of Chicago." Victor offered her a simple nod, no words needed. Emma inhaled deeply, savoring the unfamiliar sensation of cold air without the bitter taste of fear. In the days that followed, the news exploded across the city. Headlines chronicled not only Emma's case, but the network that had preyed on the homeless. Greaves' confession led to Malone's arrest, alongside several of his associates. The District Attorney's Office launched a formal investigation into law enforcement's negligence and the practices that had allowed such exploitation to fester unchecked. Victor, despite numerous interview requests, stayed mostly silent, choosing instead to focus on supporting Sarah and Elaine as they advocated for the other affected individuals. Many homeless people who had remained silent out of fear now began to step forward, encouraged by Emma's courage and the undeniable exposure of the scheme. Emma, though free, faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life. Freedom did not erase the trauma or the weight of what she had endured. She found herself wandering familiar streets, this time as an observer rather than a survivor. The city looked the same, yet everything about it felt different. She was no longer invisible, but visibility came with its own challenges. Sarah, visiting Emma at a small temporary shelter provided by one of Victor's partner organizations, acknowledged this reality. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Victor's foundation is offering more than just a place to stay. They want to help you get back on your feet." Emma hesitated. After so long depending on no one but herself, trusting others felt foreign. Yet, looking around the modest but warm room, she realized the alternative: returning to a life where silence and fear dictated every choice was no longer acceptable. Victor visited her later that evening, this time not as a benefactor, but simply as someone who understood the weight of rebuilding. Sitting across from her at the small kitchen table, he didn't pitch another offer or suggest solutions. He just listened as Emma finally spoke freely about the months she had endured, the loneliness, the disbelief, the sense of being discarded by the world. Victor waited until she finished before saying, "You have the strength to start again, Emma, but you don't have to do it alone." The offer wasn't framed as charity. It was an invitation. Emma knew she could refuse, walk away, disappear into the streets where she had once found refuge. But for the first time, the path forward didn't feel like another dark alley. It felt like the first step towards something resembling life, dignity, and purpose. And Emma, though still haunted by the weight of what she had endured, knew deep down that this time she wouldn't be walking alone. Winter still lingered in Chicago, but for Emma Carter, the air no longer felt like a hostile force pressing against her every breath. Weeks had passed since her release, and though the city remained chaotic and indifferent as always, Emma moved through it differently now. She no longer avoided eye contact. She no longer shrank under the weight of invisible accusations. Yet, the scars, both visible and invisible, were undeniable. Every step toward rebuilding her life was heavy with the memories of those cold nights behind bars, the courtroom stairs, and the endless hours of being treated as less than human. Victor Langston's foundation had provided her with temporary housing in a modest but welcoming building on the city's south side. The apartment was small, but it was hers. The warmth from the radiator, the simple kitchen, and the worn but clean couch felt like luxuries after months on the streets and weeks in jail. Still, Emma struggled daily with the quiet. Freedom, as she learned, wasn't just about walking out of a cell. It was about confronting everything left behind inside. Sarah visited often, checking on Emma's progress, helping with documents, therapy referrals, and job applications. More importantly, she listened, truly listened, to Emma's fears and frustrations. Sarah had changed as well. The case had reignited a part of her that had dimmed under the weight of an overburdened system. Emma noticed it in the way Sarah spoke to other clients with renewed patience and fire, determined not to let another case slip through the cracks. Victor, true to his word, remained present but never imposing. He never framed his involvement as salvation. Instead, he treated Emma as someone capable, worthy of standing on her own. When he offered Emma a position at his foundation, it wasn't out of charity, but necessity. "We need someone like you," he had said during one of their quiet meetings. "Someone who knows what it's like to be ignored, to be written off." Emma had hesitated at first. The idea of working for the very man who had helped dismantle the case against her felt overwhelming. She wasn't sure she was ready to return to the world as anything other than a survivor. But in the quiet moments, staring at the frost-touched window of her small apartment, Emma realized she didn't want to simply survive anymore. Accepting the position was more than just accepting a job. It was a decision to take back control. Her role was modest, outreach coordinator for the Foundation's new initiative, focused on supporting homeless individuals facing legal challenges. But to Emma, it felt monumental. Her first day was a mixture of anxiety and determination. Walking into the Foundation's offices, Emma was greeted not with pitying glances, but with genuine respect. Elaine was there too, now officially contracted to oversee investigations for the initiative. She greeted Emma with a simple nod of approval, an unspoken recognition of the journey they both knew all too well. Emma's work took her back into the streets she once called home, but this time, she wasn't searching for food or warmth. She was looking for people who, like her, had been silenced, ignored, or exploited. The first time she approached a young woman huddled under a bridge, Emma felt the old fear rise, fear of rejection, of distrust. But when she sat down beside her and simply said, "I've been where you are," the young woman didn't turn away. She listened. Days turned into weeks, and Emma slowly found herself again, not the Emma who had once waited tables or the Emma who had barely survived the streets, but someone new, someone stronger. Through her work, she met dozens of people who shared fragments of her story. Every handshake, every conversation, every moment of recognition reminded her that her suffering, as cruel and unfair as it had been, now served a purpose. Victor remained a steady presence, often joining the outreach team discreetly. He never took credit, never made grand speeches. Instead, he listened and learned. Emma realized that while he had the means, he lacked the lived experience. Together, they made a formidable team, him providing the resources, her providing the understanding. Sarah continued to fight for others trapped in the system. The Foundation partnered with the Public Defender's Office to expand legal support for homeless individuals, preventing future cases like Emma's from slipping through unnoticed. Emma's story, though never officially spotlighted in the media, frenzy that followed the trial, quietly inspired change across the city. New shelters were opened. Investigations into similar exploitative networks were launched. Most importantly, conversations shifted. People began to question how easily they had dismissed someone simply because of her circumstances. One cold morning, as Emma walked through Grant Park on her way to meet with a group of volunteers, she paused. The skyline stretched above her, the city as unforgiving and indifferent as ever. But now it no longer felt insurmountable. She wasn't the woman huddled against the wind, waiting to be forgotten. She was standing, walking, changing things, however slowly, however quietly. Emma Carter's life had been torn apart by injustice, but in piecing it back together, she had forged something stronger than she ever imagined, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they were invisible. And as she stepped forward into the freezing Chicago wind, Emma knew, with certainty, she would never be invisible again,